Welcome to Public Forum, a community outreach program produced at North Idaho College on the shores of Lake Coeur d'Alene. Featuring guests from around the globe addressing a wide variety of subjects, Public Forum serves to educate and enlighten. Please join host and moderator, political scientist Tony Stewart, in welcoming today's guest.
This week we're bringing you part two of a two-part series dealing with a very, very serious and important topic, and that involves the crimes of 9/11, September the 11th, 2001. And as you know, that was followed by the 9/11 Commission, which had a remarkable report. It was a bipartisan 10-member committee, and it was headed by the former governor of New Jersey, Tom Keene, and the vice chair was the former congressman from Indiana, Lee Hamilton. Following their report to the Congress and to the President, there was created something called the 9/11 Discourse Project, and that's very, very important. Members of that project have been going across the United States to explain this issue. We're very fortunate to have back this week from last week one of those individuals. We welcome to the program Erin Smith. She is the senior assistant to the president of the 9/11 Discourse Project. She graduated with honors from, very high honors, from Truman State University. Also, she speaks, as we said, around the country to students, and this will go on through December at the time of the broadcast of this program. Our guest holds a BS degree in political science, and she worked for a summer as a research assistant at Harvard, and she has many, many other honors, including such things as she was chosen by Glamour magazine as one of the top 12 college women in the United States, as well as on her own campus. Twice she was chosen the Student of the Year, or the most influential student. Welcome back to our program. It was so good to have you here. You're so informed. And this week we look forward particularly to talking about the recommendations that the Commission has to try to keep us safe.
Thank you. I'm particularly excited to be talking about the recommendations because they focus on what we can do now to move forward past the events of 9/11 to the lessons of 9/11.
Yes. And I'm very pleased to have our two regular panelists, Janelle Burke and Erna Reinhardt, and Janelle will start today's questioning.
Before we get into the recommendations, can you please tell our viewers what kind of an outline that the Commission report has? This is actually the Commission report that the Commission formulated in order to report back to the Congress about the events of 9/11. So can you give us some idea about how
Exactly.
that
In
works?
a nutshell, the 9/11 Commission investigated the events leading up to and on the day of September 11th, and then had an 80-member staff with 10 commissioners who looked at these events and came up with, as best they could, a comprehensive accounting for those events, what happened leading up to that day and what happened on that day. They then issued the 9/11 report, and it came out July 22nd, 2004. They organized it, though, so that it could be read in sections or as an entire narrative. So it talks about the hijacking of the planes, it talks about the federal response in the agencies, it talks about the emergency response, it talks about previous acts of terrorism in the history of Al-Qaeda and the rise of Osama bin Laden. The most important chapters, we feel, are chapters 12 and 13, which are the recommendations. 41 recommendations the Commission issued that they feel will make the country safer and more secure. So the two chapters, in very plain speak, are called What Should We Do and How Should We Do It?
Thank you.
Erna Reinhardt.
And welcome back to the show.
Thank you.
One of the recommendations that's in the 9/11 Commission report seems like a very basic thing to me, and I'm troubled a little bit that we haven't made more progress in this area, and that's the area of improving public safety communications. And the example that you gave earlier was that when there is an incident, the firemen can't always talk to the policemen. So share with us what that recommendation is and maybe where we're at in that, in making progress in that area.
The issue here is radio spectrum, which was loaned back in the mid-1990s to broadcasters to ease with our national transition from analog to digital. When we did that, we took away some of the abilities of first responders, like firemen and policemen, to talk to each other in the case of an emergency. So just as you mentioned, it's sometimes possible for policemen to talk to policemen and firemen to talk to firemen, but not for policemen to talk to firemen. In an emergency situation, this is unacceptable. There are movements now in the Congress to get this spectrum reallocated to the emergency responders, but it's slow going and it's being bogged down by the political processes. So what we have recommended was that for the safety of people, both first responders and the people they're responding to, we need to have every tool we can at their disposal, especially in communicating back and forth to each other. We saw that this was a problem on 9/11 when we had firemen going up into the towers of the World Trade Centers who were sometimes unaware of evacuation orders, firemen who weren't able to communicate with people on the outside because of the weakness of signal and things like that. And that's not the only thing that it applies to. We have not changed that since 9/11. It's been 4 years since then, and it seems to me like a common sense solution to things, but we've actually seen this become a problem again, and that's just recently with Hurricanes Katrina and Rita. Again here, not a terrorist attack, but a catastrophe, a regional catastrophe that had multiple agencies responding at the same time. And because they didn't have the communications equipment that they should, there was sometimes unnecessary redundancy of effort. So to us, this is something that can easily be fixed. There is a solution. It just needs to actually happen. The schedule right now is for the return to the emergency responders to happen in January of 2009. And to us, that's just too late. That's banking on a lot of time with no need for this communication ability, which we think there will be. So there are some people, Senator McCain in particular, who have proposed ideas that would push this along faster, and we think that it's one of the common sense solutions to a problem that we have now.
I was so impressed with the report as I was examining it with the what I guess is Part 7. I'm not sure about you mentioned the chapters already and its recommendations. We last week examined so much about what I guess we're overconfident about our security of our country, and then we listed a lot of the mistakes that were made through the system itself. But the recommendations can be very helpful in safety of our country, and they're in 3 parts, and I want to briefly go through those with you, and our panel may want to pursue in more detail. I see that they're called 3 strategies. And the first one is attack terrorists and their organizations. Let's talk that one first. Tell us some things that the Commission said concerning how we root them out, how we find them. Because unlike a nation state where with Germany or Italy or Japan in World War II, you could direct your resources a certain place, and if you defeat them, then that country would surrender. This is a different, same concept of attacking the threat, but also it's not in a country. So what do we mean by attack terrorists and their organizations?
Some of the recommendations are very general, and some of them are more specific. And in all of the areas of our recommendations, you'll find a mix of both. One of the recommendations that appears in the very beginning of Chapter 12 is to root out terrorist sanctuaries, to find places, whether they be countries or specific regions, a host group, anyone who is hospitable to terrorist organizations, and to target those kinds of places.
Like we did in Afghanistan.
Exactly. Because when we do that, we can cut off some of the supply that makes their operations possible. So it involves sometimes confronting some very difficult and very long-standing situations. One of those is our relationship with Saudi Arabia. Another one of our recommendations is to openly and honestly confront our relationship with Saudi Arabia as a country, and to make that relationship based on more than oil. Now, that's been a mixed bag so far. We have made progress. The leaders in power right now in Saudi Arabia have made more direct and more pointed statements in favor of political reform and in favor of democracy in general than we've seen in the past. And they did hold elections. Earlier this year, in 2005, they did hold elections. Now, the flip side of that is that the elections only covered half of the municipal council seats. The other half were still appointed by the government.
Plus women couldn't vote.
And the councils have yet to meet.
Okay.
So it's unclear what their authority is. But the point of this first prong, as you're saying, is to come up with a multifaceted, multi-pronged approach. It's not going to be just military intervention or not just covert operations that does this, because like you said, it's too difficult of a task to do it with just a one-sided strategy. Then
I'll go to point 2, and you've already built the bridge. The report indicates that we should prevent continued growth of this Islamic terrorists or extremists. Now, the overwhelming majority of Islamic people are peace-loving, and it's about 1.6 billion in the world. And this faction that's so extreme is very small. But what did the Commission mean by dealing with how we would work with the great overwhelming majority of the Muslim world and isolate the extremists.
Well, you made a very important point, and that is that the people we're talking about here are an extremely small fraction who have perverted a beautiful world religion. That there are, like you said, over a billion people, well over a billion people who practice this, and that the vast, vast majority of them do not hold these same beliefs that we are fighting when we say that we're fighting Islamist terrorism. Two of the ways that we can do that, one is through public diplomacy. That's the idea of sharing words and thoughts and ideas with people abroad through things like scholarships and exchange programs, through library posts, through the promotion of free exchange of ideas and of tolerance and things like that. Another way that people don't often think about in terms of this multi-pronged approach and of supporting this part of the world without supporting these specific terrorists is economic policies. There's a goal to have a Middle East free trade area by 2013, and we've already seen steps in that direction. There are several countries that we have signed free trade areas with. The point of economic development is that when you create and I'm sure as a political science professor you know exactly what I'm talking about, but when you create economic development that then makes your middle class bigger, it creates stabilization, and stabilized countries are more likely to foster economic and political reform, which often go hand in hand. So it is in our interest that these countries, first of all, are exposed to American ideas that oppose what Al-Qaeda says we are, and secondly, have their own economic development to be further integrated into the world trading system.
And the middle class is essential to democracy, as
Yes.
we've learned in our country. And the third strategy, and then I'll go back to the panel, is it's headed protect against and prepare for terrorist attacks.
That's what we can do now to best prepare our country for these kinds of things. We would like to think that we are preventing as best we can through all avenues available to us, through the military, through the CIA, through covert action, through all sorts of things, both offensive and defensive, to prevent this kind of thing from happening. And it's important that we make steps forward there. What's also important, though, is that we prepare ourselves if something were to happen. And that's where states and local areas come into play in an enormous amount. This isn't just about individuals who have gallons of water at home. While that's important, it's about coming up with community strategies. Individuals and businesses and municipal areas coming up with what would happen to us if an emergency happened, whether that be terrorism or a natural disaster. Some businesses are great examples of this. They have evacuation plans, they have emergency contacts, they have shelter-in-place drills, all sorts of things. But there's always more that can be done. Just as a short example of that, some private companies are now coming up with shelter-in-place drills in case it were for some reason unsafe to go outside, say there had been some sort of chemical agent deployed or something like that. But what they don't always account for is that you can plan as much as you want for your employees to stay in place, but if those employees have children in a school, very few of them are willing to abandon their children. Most of them will be trying to leave their office and go to the schools. So that's why the community all taking part in this, so that the school says, we know what to do with your child if something were to happen and your child is at school and you're at work. We can assure you that we have thought about this before. So that's what it's about, is preparedness.
Thank you. Janelle Burke.
My next question will have to do with air travel and ways that people can be safe. It's now a means of travel that we all use. And so what are the kinds of things that the Commission recommended in order to make air travel more safe?
Well, actually, air travel is the area that has gotten the most money in terms of our spending on transportation security since 9/11, and that's because that's what was used on September 11th. The flip side to that is that other things like Amtrak and cargo shipping and things like that are not actually being used, not actually being protected as much and not given the same allocations of money. To answer your question, though, there are certain things that needed to be better addressed. CAPS, we mentioned on the first week's program, is computer-assisted passenger pre-screening. That program uses algorithms to decide which passengers are more or less likely to become threats, but as it was working on September 11th, the only consequence, if you as an individual were selected by CAPS, is that your checked luggage would have been held off the plane until it was confirmed that you had gotten on the plane. So even working perfectly, CAPS would have done nothing to stop suicide hijackers like the kind we saw on September 11th. So there's CAPS 2, and there's a couple of other things that are going on now, but you can see the manifestation of some of these things. There are longer lines at the airports. There are things now, everything from the requirements that you take off your shoes when you're going through airport security, to things that are in place in some airports that aren't in place in others, like puffer machines or explosive detections. So there have been things that have been done. We need more, though. We need cargo screening. We need other ways to verify what's going on, and we especially need to expand it even beyond aviation, which is the most notable, but right now the most protected and the least likely, not the least likely, but less likely to be the one that's not getting as much funding as it needs.
Thank you.
One of the recommendations, Aaron, I think, if I portray this correctly, is that that the majority of the preparedness money should go to New York City and Washington, D.C. And I think that's one of the recommendations that's being scrutinized more carefully, because I think there's people that disagree with that. Share with us maybe the rationalization for that recommendation, and then where that discussion is going on now.
This is a huge discussion right now in Congress, Homeland Security funding formulas, and exactly what the math will be that determines how much money do different areas get. And there are differences of opinions, especially within the House and the Senate. I mean, if you've ever taken a civics lesson and you know what created the House and the Senate based on whether you're a state or with a big population or a little population and the power of people versus state powers, then you can understand where this comes from. Small states obviously don't want to be left out of this, and they shouldn't be left out of this. No one should. But there has to be a prioritization of where our risks and threats are the greatest. Some of the formulas, they're being compromised and debated right now in Congress by your representatives and representatives from across the country. And the math differs a little bit. Some of them allocate more strictly according to more equitable in terms of guaranteeing minimums for each state. Some of the math gets a little bit complicated, but some of the formulas that are proposed have a little bit more money allocated if you're a border state. So if you share a border with Canada or with Mexico, such as Idaho, then you do have concerns that aren't relevant to other places or aren't as relevant to places like Kansas or Nebraska. Some of them account for things like what kind of critical infrastructure you have in your state, how many people you have in your state, whether your population is spread out or concentrated, and what those means in terms of the differences for protecting those areas. So the answer is that it's a huge political battle right now. I think we'll see this play out in the next couple of months to see what exactly we do. The 9/11 Commission's position is that it should be based on risk, that even with the most risk-based formula that's currently proposed, every state still is getting something. And then it's up to state and local municipalities to use those dollars to the best ability they can to protect what they have and to make it make sense at a local level. Washington, D.C. cannot decide for Coeur d'Alene and for every other community in America how they should use their money because they don't have the local expertise they need. We think that it should be based on risk so that we can make priorities and do the best we can with preventing as best we can based on the information we have.
Before I go into my question, for our viewers who weren't with us last week, there's a website where they can really get a lot more information, and we're limited in time. And of course, then there's the publication of the book, the 9/11 Commission Report. We have those. I think we're having those websites now. If you'll repeat those from last week.
The 9/11 Commission's website is www.9-11commission.gov. That's all the information from the investigation and the research of the 9/11 Commission.
And you can print the whole report if you wish.
You can print the whole report. You can read it on the computer or print it for free. You can also see transcripts of the hearings that they conducted. The second website is the 9/11 Public Discourse Project's website at www.9-11pdp.org. We also have transcripts of all of our activities. So over the summer, we held a series of 7 panels of experts to evaluate 1 year later how are we doing on the recommendations in different topic areas. All of our press releases and our statements from the commissioners are all available on the website, and everything on both sites is free for download.
I want to go into another area that's so serious, and I wish we could sit here today and say that we are now totally safe, and what a terrible threat this is with these international terrorists. And we focus so much, and understandably so, because of the planes that went into the buildings, but there are so many other ways that terrorists think, and will we not be making a mistake if we concentrate so heavily and say that the next attack, if it ever comes, and God forbid that would happen, but it might not be through planes and airplanes. So one thing I want you to talk about that is such a magnitude of concern, and that is such things as dirty bombs or a suitcase-type nuclear bomb or chemicals and all. the Commission was also very concerned and addressed that too.
This is a huge, huge issue, and most experts today agree that the single greatest threat that we face as the United States is a weapon of mass destruction in the hands of terrorists. Al-Qaeda has made no secret of the fact that they considered a religious obligation to acquire and use weapons of mass destruction against the United States. They've also made it clear that they do not distinguish between military personnel and civilians. Right now, one of the problems we have is unsecured and unaccounted for nuclear materials in Russia and in the former Soviet states. There are, however, programs that are working to contain that. One of them is called the Cooperative Threat Reduction. It was spearheaded by Senators Nunn and Lugar. It was actually invented in the Cold War era and has been adapted as time goes on to the threats that we face today. And one of the things that they do is they try to reduce the amount of unsecured nuclear material that could be, and we hope it's not, but could be available to the highest bidder, or could be available through sale or trafficking to people who would have nefarious purposes for it. So you mentioned dirty bombs too. One of the reassurances, if you can call it that, is that it's hard to build nuclear bombs. You have to have the expertise, and there are a limited number of people in the world who know how to do this. It's not as hard to come up with a dirty bomb. HBO actually has a movie, a made-for-TV movie that they sometimes play at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning that's called Dirty Bomb, and it explains a little bit about how this were to work. The idea basically is that terrorists could take radiological material, and either if it was not weapons grade material or if they did not have the knowledge to actually turn it into a nuclear bomb, they could still basically put it next to a regular bomb, for lack of a better term, so it would explode and disperse this material throughout the air. So while it wouldn't create what we know of as a mushroom cloud, it still would have the devastating effects of radiation. If that were to happen, it could be devastating to people at the time in terms of immediate casualties, but also to that space in terms of how long that area would be contaminated and under quarantine. In the movie that HBO produced, I think it happens in London in the financial district, and those buildings and those businesses are unable to go back for, I think, 30 years because of the effects of this. So there are a multitude of problems that all relate to this issue, and while we've been making progress, the magnitude of the problem is just dwarfing the efforts that we've made so far. The 9/11 Commission's recommendation is to continue to support this. It's an expensive program, but it's effective, and it does work. There's that, and there's a Proliferation Security Initiative and a couple of other programs that will actually make progress on this. One of the U.S. reports to the UN said that there is a high probability that terrorist groups will attempt to use WMDs in the next 2 years. And I said this in my speech to the students at North Idaho College. But that report was issued 2 years and 5 months ago. We have been lucky that nothing has happened so far, but we can't let that let us become complacent about things. We need to continue to work on it.
One other thing that was so disturbing, and you made that point today too with the students, is that it didn't take billions or even millions of dollars for the terrorists to carry out 9/11. It was between $400,000 and $500,000 compared with our annual defense budget of
$300 billion with a B.
That is just very, very disturbing.
It is. There's a bit of good news here. 2 pieces of good news. There was a terrorist group in Japan called Shinrikyo that deployed sarin nerve gas in their subway. They had been attempting to get WMDs in the early 90s for years, and they had thousands of adherents in Russia, and they were never able to do it. That's good news, actually, that they were not able to do it, even with that amount of determination. Another piece of good news specific to us is that Presidents Bush and Putin, in February of 2005 of this year, issued statements that they really are making efforts toward this. The dismantlement of ICBMs, of intercontinental ballistic missiles, continues at the rate of 8 per month. The Russians are continuing to open up more of the facilities to what we call locking them down. That means hardening the walls, installing security cameras, installing radiation detectors to make this safer. The problem is that we just have a lot more to do.
On the other side of that coin, that's good news, that part, but on the other side of the coin is, what if some country has nuclear weapons and is a country that keeps them under control, but then they lose the government and the terrorists take over? that country, then we would really have a problem.
There are a multitude of scenarios and hypothetical situations that would all could lead to catastrophic effects for us or for other countries. One group, it's not my organization, but an organization that we have worked with in the past called the Nuclear Threat Initiative, is led by Senator Sam Nunn, a former senator from Georgia. And he and Ted Turner and a couple of others, Senator Lugar, have teamed up to create a nonprofit, and they actually made a movie out of this called Last Best Chance. It's available for free on their website. You can go to www.nti.org and request a free copy. It's a 45-minute movie that shows Fred Thompson as the president, and it explains a hypothetical situation where people with access to these kinds of materials in Russia are bribed, and then these materials come over the border into the United States from Canada. So it's about 45 minutes long. They call it a docudrama. There are no explosions and no car chases or anything like that. It's just as to make people think about and be aware of this possibility, and that we need to be doing proactive steps about it.
Fred Thompson is the actor and a former U.S. Senator from Tennessee.
It plays on Law and Order.
Yes,
is where
he does.
people might know him from.
And he was a U.S.
But he was a real senator.
Yeah. Janelle Burke.
Our time is very limited, but do you have some suggestions for people, what they could do right now, very practical suggestions to help their families be protected in the event of an emergency? Maybe 3 things.
One of our most common suggestions is for people to read part of or the entire 9/11 report. The more people know about this and the more people are interested in and aware of these issues, the more active interest they'll take in their own lives and how these things affect our daily lives, whether you live inside Washington, D.C. or another major metropolitan area, or whether you don't. Family preparedness is probably the best thing that a citizen could do on an individual level to do this. So this involves talking to your family, talking to the people you live with, your parents, your children, your roommates, whatever your situation is, to understand what would happen if an emergency were to occur. That means coming up with communication plans. You have to think about the possibilities that maybe cell phones won't work, or maybe the phone lines are jammed. And these are the difficult things to imagine, but the more preparation you do ahead of time, the better. I think local and municipal governments would be happy if people were to take seriously the idea that it's a good idea to have food and water and emergency supplies on hand. We saw this, again, not with terrorism, but with another catastrophe. With Katrina, it was very difficult in those first couple of days to coordinate the movement and the transportation of supplies to people who needed them. The families who probably fared better than those who had not prepared, who had not thought of this maybe, were those who had gallons of distilled water, of cans of food with a can opener, of battery-powered flashlights, radios, that kind of thing. So.
On that note, we have to bring the permanent conclusion. The clock always wins. So, Erin Smith, thank you. It's been so important to have you here, and you've been so informative, and express our appreciation back to your organization.
I will indeed, and thank you again for inviting us.
Ladies and gentlemen, our program has been one of the most serious that we've done, these 2 programs in all of our years, and we hope you've found things that are helpful to you, and we'll join you next week with a different subject. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
Recorded on the campus of North Idaho College, Public Forum is the longest-running in-house college production on PBS. Each episode is pre-recorded live and is an educational outreach from North Idaho College. Please join us at this same time next week for another edition of Public Forum on this public television station.